The Virginia summer of 1802 pressed against the earth like a punishment, thick enough to taste, heavy enough to bend the spine. The Barrow plantation sat beneath that weight in uneasy stillness, its fields wavering under the kind of sun that split lips and cracked soil. The enslaved worked in silence, broken only by the faint rustle of cotton leaves brushing against one another. A shallow whisper compared to the deeper currents of fear that ran through every soul on the property. The house stood tall and whitewashed, but the paint did nothing to hide the rot in its foundations. Rot not of wood, but of the lives it fed upon. Inside, Eleanor Barrow fought through labor in a dim, sweltering room, the windows nailed shut to keep the world out. Sweat pooled in her hair and soaked into the linen sheets beneath her. For hours, she drifted between consciousness and the blank edge of exhaustion, her body racked by waves that left her trembling. When the midwife finally delivered the first child, a pale, wailing infant with a shock of sandy hair, a thin smile cut across Eleanor's drawn face. The second child followed minutes later, nearly identical, and a sense of triumph flickered through. Her continuation, legacy, proof that her lineage remained clean and strong. But then came the third. Silence settled over the room when the midwife lifted the last infant into the candlelight. The child's skin bore a deeper shade, unmistakably so, as though marked by a truth that should never have existed in a Barrow cradle. The midwife's breath caught. Eleanor's eyes snapped open wider than they had been all night. Her heartbeat thrashed violently in her chest, not from the birth, but from recognition. Something she had feared, or perhaps something she had tried to bury deep enough that the earth itself might forget. No amount of heat could burn away the truth she saw in that baby's face. The air grew colder, despite the temperature. A single thought spiraled through her mind, vicious and sharp enough to wound. This child did not belong to her husband, and its existence, its very presence, was a threat, great enough to unravel her entire world. The plantations around them thrived on image, on rumors whispered and traded like currency. A mistress who birthed a child darker than her own shadow would become a scandal, a humiliation, a subject of quiet snickering in parlors and loud gossip in fields. Barrow pride could not withstand that blow. She refused to let the humiliation stain her name. From the hallway, Mary stood waiting, summoned earlier when the birth began. Mary had learned long ago that the call of the mistress could carry the weight of danger. She stepped inside quietly, her hands clasped before her. The flickering candlelight washed over her face, revealing both youth and the tiredness carved into her eyes. Her life had been a litany of orders, and she learned to read the difference between those born of necessity and those born of panic. The air was full of panic now, sharp as cut metal. Eleanor's gaze fixed on Mary with a mixture of desperation and fierce command. She lifted the dark-skinned infant in trembling arms and held him out as though distance could lessen the reality of him. Her breath came uneven, her fury barely contained beneath a brittle composure. She needed someone to absorb this secret, to carry it where her own hands could not. Mary approached carefully, fear prickling across her skin. She looked at the child, small, helpless, unaware, and something stirred inside her, something like instinct or memory. She did not have to be told the truth. She saw it as clearly as Eleanor did. The resemblance to certain features among the enslaved men was undeniable. Rumors had whispered about the master's late-night wanderings. Rumors had hinted at the kind of violations plantation men chose never to name, but frequently carried out. Rumors sometimes told the truth. The moment she accepted the child into her arms, the weight of the mistress's will settled over her. The order hung in the room like smoke. This child must be hidden, removed, buried in secrecy. Before anyone could witness what had come from Eleanor's womb, Mary cradled the infant against her chest. His skin radiated warmth. His tiny fingers curled weakly as he nuzzled into her. A pang cut through her heart, the kind of ache she felt whenever she saw something fragile standing on the edge of a cruel world. She had protected many children born on that plantation, but none under circumstances as dangerous as this. Leaving the room felt like stepping from one cage into another. The hallway was dark, shadows stretching along the walls like grasping hands. Mary's footsteps were soft, measured, each one taken with the desperate hope of going unnoticed. Outside, the night welcomed her with thick humidity, the cicadas screaming into the air as though declaring her secret. She held the baby closer to silence, the pounding in her chest. The smokehouse stood far from the main quarters, its roof sagging, its door hanging crookedly. Long abandoned, forgotten. A perfect hiding place for a truth the mistress wanted erased. Mary slipped inside, the cool darkness wrapping around her. She laid the baby on an old blanket she had hidden earlier, her hands trembling slightly as she brushed his cheek. The child blinked slowly, eyes wide and unclouded by fear. Mary felt a crushing sense of responsibility settle over her. She could not stop the world from being cruel, but perhaps she could soften its first blow. Hours passed before she returned to the quarters. She moved silently, battling the dread rising inside her. Secrets had a way of crawling into the light, no matter how deeply buried. And now she carried one that could ignite the fury of both mistress and master. A secret born in blood and fear. In the days that followed, Mary returned to the abandoned smokehouse when she could, bringing milk, torn pieces of cloth, anything she could spare. Each time she entered that space, the baby reached for her with small, trusting hands. Unaware of how close he lived to danger, she named him in her mind, not aloud, not where the walls might hear. A name whispered only in her heart. Isaiah, a name meaning salvation, a hint of hope in a world that crushed hope into dust. But hope was fragile on the Barrow Plantation. And secrets? Even more so. 2 weeks passed before something shifted. Overseer Tom noticed Mary slipping away after dusk, her steps too purposeful to be casual. Suspicion lit his eyes like a match. Overseers did not need proof. They needed only curiosity. And curiosity on a plantation could be fatal. He followed her one night, keeping distance, watching her disappear into the trees. And when she emerged minutes later, empty-handed but with a trace of worry etched into her face, the seed of danger took root, and danger, once planted, would grow. The sun was dipping low when Overseer Tom's suspicions hardened into certainty. The sky had that rust-colored tint that always fell over the plantation when the day's heat refused to loosen its grip. Tom moved through the shadows like a man, hunting vermin, convinced that Mary was hiding something worth uncovering. Overseers lived for control, thrived on the knowledge that their eyes reached into every corner. When something escaped their notice, it was an insult. And Tom never tolerated insult. Mary walked ahead, unaware of the danger stalking behind her. The path she took twisted between henhouse and stable, then cut toward the overgrown edge of the property, where the smokehouse sagged like a tired animal. It looked abandoned to anyone who didn't know better. But Tom watched her disappear inside. Days earlier, watched her emerge, with worry pressed deep between her brows. Something was hidden there. Something important enough for her to risk time away from her assigned duties. He returned to the house that evening with a mind simmering, a hidden stash of food, stolen tools, a meeting place for whispered talk of rebellion. Each possibility fed his irritation. He intended to uncover whatever she guarded and bring it to the master with a sense of triumph. Overseers craved moments of triumph, the way hungry dogs craved scraps. They needed to prove their value. Mary, unaware of the tightening noose around her, spent her night tending to the baby in the smokehouse. The air inside had grown stale, but she made it a sanctuary as best she could. She used scraps of fabric to soften the wooden floor, bowls of water to cool the rising heat. Songs hummed under her breath to soothe the restless squirm of the infant. Isaiah had grown stronger in the 2 weeks since his birth. His cries, once faint and hesitant, now carried a firm insistence that echoed faintly through the gaps in the smokehouse walls. His eyes followed her with the trust of a newborn, who knew one face, one voice, one pair of hands. Mary knew every breath he took, every curl of his fingers. It tore at her to think what might happen if anyone else learned of him. Infants born to enslaved women were property, but infants born from the mistress's woman's fence, whose skin told stories no one wanted to hear, were something worse. They were threats, and threats were erased. She fed him goat's milk stolen from the barn before sunrise, careful to take only enough to blend into the day's harvest. Every risk she took carved a new line of fear inside her, but she could not stop. Something deeper than fear compelled her. Perhaps it was compassion, perhaps guilt, perhaps the memory of children she'd lost too soon to fever, hunger, or the cruelty of a system that didn't value their lives. One night, while Mary rocked the baby in the groaning wooden chair she'd found behind the smokehouse, a rustle outside pricked her ears. Heart hammering, she froze. The moon cast a pale glow through the cracks in the walls, but shadows moved beyond it, in shapes she couldn't read. She waited, holding her breath. Silence returned, yet she sensed something unsettled in the air, as though unseen eyes had wandered too close. The next morning, Eleanor Barrow woke with the same unease. The two pale infants slept side by side in their ornate cradle, while she watched them with a fractured smile. The household believed she had birthed twins, nothing more. The midwife had kept the secret sealed behind her thinning lips, refusing even to look Eleanor directly in the eye during her visits. Shame had become the mistress's constant companion, pacing at her heels. Tightening around her throat, she spent her days trying to maintain the facade of gentility. She hosted tea with neighbors, forcing herself to smile when their eyes drifted toward the cradle. Her husband, Thomas Barrow, had not returned from his trading trip yet, and she prayed he would remain away long enough for her to adjust the narrative of her life. Twins, perfect twins, healthy, beautiful, and unquestionably white. That was the story she repeated like scripture, convincing herself as fiercely as she hoped to convince the world. But secrets had a way of rotting from the inside out. One evening, while the sun dimmed into amber hues, Tom approached the mistress on the back veranda. His boots left prints in the soft dirt, carrying with them the sour smell of sweat and suspicion. Eleanor stiffened when she saw him approach. She had always disliked the overseer's presence, the way his eyes lingered too long on both the enslaved and the family alike. His hunger for control barely concealed beneath obedience. He stood beside her, watching the fields as though surveying every soul bent beneath the weight of labor. His voice broke the stillness with the smoothness of a blade sliding from its sheath. Something strange had been happening near the old smokehouse. Something involving Mary. A shiver traveled through Eleanor despite the heat. She asked what he meant, her tone clipped, defensive. Tom described Mary's odd disappearances, how she slipped through the dusk like someone carrying contraband. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the veranda railing until her knuckles whitened. If Tom had noticed Mary's visits, it was only a matter of time before he followed her fully. Only a matter of time before the secret she had tried so desperately to bury resurfaced with violent clarity. Fear wrapped around her ribs. She needed time. She needed Mary to remain unseen. She needed the overseer distracted long enough to regain control of the narrative unraveling around her. Tom, smelling the tension in her silence, pressed further. His curiosity sharpened. He suggested checking the smokehouse himself. Eleanor forced her voice to remain calm, insisting there was no need, that she had tasks for Mary in that area. Tom's eyes narrowed slightly, as though sensing a lie beneath her polished tone. He stepped away eventually, but not with the ease of a man convinced. He left with the gait of someone planning to return when no one watched. That night, Eleanor paced her room with the restless steps of a trapped animal. The twins slept in their cradle, their soft breaths the only sound. but her mind stayed fixed on the third child, hidden at the edge of the property, threatening to topple everything she had built with the fragile veneer of respectability. Mary returned to the smokehouse once more, under the cloak of darkness. Isaiah stirred weakly when she lifted him, his small body warm against her chest. She whispered assurances into the thick air, not because she believed them, but because she needed to hear the sound of hope, even if it felt like a lie. She didn't know Tom had already been there earlier that day. She didn't know he had found the faint imprint of a child's blanket in the dust. She didn't know he had seen the tiny tracks of disturbed straw, too small for an animal, too fresh to dismiss. She didn't know the overseer now believed he had uncovered something far more valuable than a stash of stolen goods. The kind of secret that could elevate a man in power, the kind of secret that could destroy a woman in fear, and the kind of secret that could kill a child. By the fourth week, the heat had taken on a new weight, as though the sun itself sensed a secret festering on the plantation and meant to draw it out by force. The air shimmered above the fields, and the enslaved moved through their work with a dull, exhausted rhythm, but beneath that rhythm pulsed something more frantic. Something Mary carried in her chest every moment as she tended to her tasks. The baby could no longer stay in the smokehouse. Tom had already sniffed too close. Mary felt the walls closing in by the hour. Every creak of branches, every crunch of footsteps sent her pulse racing. She had no safe place left on the property, and yet she had nowhere else to go. She knew what the world beyond the plantation looked like. She'd heard stories from the enslaved who had been caught trying to run. Some returned with raw stripes across their backs. Some never returned at all. Still, she weighed the risks in her mind with brutal honesty. To stay meant certain discovery. To run meant near certain death. But risk changed shape when someone else's life lay in her arms. Isaiah was innocent, born into a nightmare he had never chosen. She could not accept him dying because she hesitated. She spent nights awake in the quarters, staring at the ceiling, imagining paths through the woods, routes along the riverbank, places where trees grew thick enough to swallow a person whole. Each possibility felt half-formed, dangerous, but she held on to them with a desperate hope. Others noticed the strain in her expression, though no one asked. The enslaved recognized the look of someone carrying a secret too heavy for one soul. Ruth watched her more closely, her gaze deep and sad, as though she sensed the crushing weight Mary bore. Silence was their shared refuge, but also their most painful truth. Meanwhile, in the big house, the tension knotted tighter each day. Eleanor Barrow moved through her home with the restless steps of a woman whose lies had begun to gnaw at her from within. She held her babies, her surviving narrative, close to her chest, though her mind remained fixed on the one she had cast out. Fear hollowed her from the inside. She wondered if Mary had grown bold enough to consider using the secret as leverage in unthinkable betrayal. Yet fear twisted reality until every shadow became a threat. She paced the hallways at night, unable to sleep. Her husband would return soon. She felt the ticking of time in her bones. He must never know. The panic of that truth drove her like a lash dot. Thomas Barrow returned. 2 nights later, the sound of carriage wheels crunching over gravel stirred the plantation from its uneasy stillness. Word spread quickly among the enslaved, who lowered their heads and braced for the disruption a master's return always brought. Mary felt a cold, dread coil through her ribs. The arrival of the master meant another pair of sharp eyes, searching for imperfections, another threat to the fragile sanctuary she'd built for Isaiah. Tom waited near the steps as Thomas Barrow climbed out, dusting the travel from his coat. The overseer wasted no time. He leaned in close, murmuring something meant only for the master's ears. Something about suspicious behavior, something about the smokehouse, something worth investigating. Barrow's expression darkened as he listened, and Mary watched from the distance. Heart pounding, impossibly hard. Later that night, while the master settled inside the house, Mary slipped to the smokehouse to retrieve Isaiah. She moved fast, but not fast enough to outrun the terror burning through her legs. The baby cried weakly from hunger and heat as she gathered him, cradling his tiny body against her chest. She pressed frantic kisses to his forehead, tears stinging her eyes. She knew she couldn't carry him back to the quarters anymore. Too many eyes, too many questions, too many dangers. There was only one place left that might offer even a moment of safety. The forest, dense, humid, crawling with insects and alive with creatures that could just as easily harm as hide her, but safer than any corner under Tom's watch. She slipped between the trees, leaves brushing against her arms as she walked deeper, letting the darkness swallow her. The forest floor pressed soft beneath her feet, and Isaiah squirmed in her grasp. His cries muted against her shoulder. She found a hollow between roots, wide enough for her to sit and hold him close, hidden from casual sight. Fireflies flickered around her like weary spirits drifting between worlds. She rocked the baby gently, her breath shuddering with fear and exhaustion. Hours passed in the stifling heat, every sound amplified by the stillness. She drifted in and out of restless dozing, waking at the faintest rustle, clutching Isaiah each time as though the world meant to rip him away. By dawn, she knew she couldn't stay in the forest forever. She had to return to the plantation before someone noticed she was missing. She needed to keep up the appearance of normalcy, or suspicion would grow even faster. She tucked Isaiah beneath her shawl, holding him tight against her stomach, praying his small breaths. Stayed quiet as she crept back toward the edge of the fields. She didn't know that Tom had woken early. She didn't know he'd already reported unusual activity to the master. She didn't know the master had agreed to confront her that very morning. She walked straight into danger without knowing it was waiting. When she reached the quarters, the sun was just beginning to rise, bathing the horizon in a bleeding orange glow. She slipped inside, hoping to lay Isaiah down and gather herself. But the moment she crossed the threshold, she sensed the shift in the air. Silence, stillness, eyes following her movements too carefully. She placed the baby in the hidden corner she had prepared beneath loose floorboards, covering him gently, whispering blind reassurances as she pressed the board back into place. His faint cries muffled beneath the wood, but she hesitated, her heart beat loud in her ears. Would it be enough? Would he stay quiet long enough for her to mislead the men who sought the truth? She turned and found Ruth standing in the doorway. The older woman's expression held a heavy sorrow, as though she already knew the storm Mary had tried so fiercely to outrun. Ruth didn't speak, but her eyes delivered the warning. They were coming, and soon. Mary's pulse thrashed. She stepped forward, opening her mouth to speak, but Ruth only placed a trembling hand on her arm, steadying her with a touch that carried more comfort than words ever could. Outside, footsteps approached slow, deliberate, crushing the earth beneath them. Mary didn't need to look to know whose they were. Master Barrow, and Tom, and perhaps others. The secret was slipping from her grasp, and once they entered that doorway, everything would change.